The bad news is it wasn't an accident. I was mugged in Oslo. It was somebody else's plan to make a fast buck. Norway is not in the European Union, and the people who mugged me were not part of the Council of Europe either, but things happen. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I started researching East Central Europe shortly after the Berlin Wall fell, and 20-odd years ago, I did not know which country would lapse back into its interwar history, which was not as democratic as Sweden, for example. I'm glad to be here, but sad to be here because of what was being discussed in the previous.
Maybe we need some minutes.
In the previous talk, my own focus on representing Europeans and democracy is more about representation than the rule of law. And I think the unfortunate challenge that Hungary presents is which laws, the laws of the state or the laws that express European, or in United Nations terms, universal values. Fortunately, most countries in Europe, they have problems. And the problem that I would like to talk about, if somebody can make this PowerPoint work, is the problem of democracy when you have both national elections, national governments, and a multinational government. Because most people in this room have two citizenships, European and Hungarian, and they have two votes for two systems. Now, the historic idea of democracy is that people can vote for an alternative government, and if they don't like what's governed, they can turn it out, or they can keep it in. And this works quite well, too well for some prime ministers throughout most of Europe. The problem of the European Union is that there are votes, but the problem is what do they represent, and you cannot dismiss the government. And therefore, when people have a chance at the European election for Parliament, the vote is no. The standard Brussels explanation is that you were represented by your national government in Brussels in the Council of Ministers. There are two problems with this. First of all, the national government is elected by about half the people who vote in their nation. This is normal, whether it's 35% or 65%, but national politics expresses disagreement. But because they are in the European Union,
Now it's in.
Okay, fine, this is okay.
It's good.
Yeah, good, so good.
Oh, come on.
No, it's good, it works. That's great. Okay. Been there. Well, this is familiar textbook democracy within member states. This presents problems because in Britain, the governing party has a majority of its supporters who are anti-EU. To be accountable to a representative assembly in Italy is no fun, because 25% of the vote goes to 5-star. To be accountable to the courts, the rule of law, and democratic human rights law is a problem. The Germans are very respectful of courts, but the courts sometimes wonder how democratic the European Union is. And the German Chancellor does not want to have a fight with the courts for reasons, historical reasons. In Portugal, the courts said it was illegal to cut civil servants' wages. Now, this struck me as an odd decision if you limit the powers of national government through the courts. But still, Portugal is a Mediterranean country. The courts work. The government respects the courts. The government needs a renewed mandate. Well, there are elections everywhere. And then the government changes the rules of the game, which is Hungary. So there are problems that Brussels faces because they have democratic representation in the member states. They have problems in Brussels, which is they have a system of pre-1914 accountability of checks and balances, which goes back to the 18th century theories and the United States Constitution. And President Obama would be the first to say, but we live in the 21st century. The one problem in Brussels has been that you need too many people to agree. You need the Parliament with co-decision. You need the Council of Ministers that represent states. The Court of Justice will agree if it's more power for the European Union. The central bank does not represent the rule of law. They represent the rule of monetary economics. And I have no problem with two-party systems, and you have a choice between the University of Chicago and Cambridge, England, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's just that raw. This is not rocket science. It's which way do we point the rockets? What is the enemy? So you have plenty of disagreements, open politics, but you don't have electoral accountability because there is no government there. Now, the European Union policy since the Eurozone crisis, and my talk is about normal politics. If money is normally part of politics, the Eurozone is now being normalized. But the problems of the Eurozone are being shared. Because to say that Germany can dominate Greece, it also means that Greece can disrupt what Germany wants to preserve, and the Republic of Cyprus. When I was in Lisbon last week, I said, how are you doing with your crisis? Not so bad. We think we'll pull through. Are you worried about being caught up by other countries like France? Because the president of France is accountable to his party, and his party doesn't like budget cuts. The streets of Paris are open. That's the president of France's problem. Good news, no, we're not worried about France. Bad news, Portugal's worried about Italy, causing a disruption of the Eurozone, and they get hit with a backwash. And so is Germany. This is called interdependence. The Brussels solution is more integration. What this chart shows is that most people who vote for Euro MPs do not want more European integration. There is a three-way division. The fact that you elect MEPs, you may do it because you're a socialist or a liberal or Christian democratic, but the people in the parliament want their voice in the Eurozone. This is what I mentioned earlier. The government in the European Council that signed up to the Pact for Growth and Stability, which means they're supposed to go home and cut their budgets. And the big numbers that they can cut are in health, education, and pensions. It's a classic problem. And that these are policies that the European Treaty says are subsidiarity. On the one hand, they should be national policies. On the other hand, the Stability Pact says you have a European commitment to a 3% deficit. And we are monitoring you. And the Financial Times is monitoring you. And international markets are monitoring you. It's not just the pointy-headed intellectuals in the IMF, but it's 28-year-olds with computers and ruthlessness. The result is that at present, the Brussels is trying to strengthen the influence of a checks and balances government on national budgets. And the people who make agreements in Brussels are then supposed to come home and get agreement in their national parliaments and with their own cabinet. And these are issues. What should we do about our national budget? Reasonable people can disagree. And in Britain, which is not in the Eurozone, there are measures of disagreement between Labour and Conservative. This is normal national politics. And what was interesting is that when Cyprus caused a problem, Brussels came out for equality. They said that the defaults on money in Cypriot banks should be shared between rich Russians and Cypriot voters. And for whatever reason, I hope the Prime Minister of Cyprus was drunk when he agreed to it in Brussels. I doubt it, but the pressures in Brussels to say yes, because when he met his cabinet the next day, they said no. And the cabinet of Cyprus threw it back in the face of Brussels and said, we don't want taking money from rich Russians. There's a lot of money, but taking money from people who only have 15,000 euros and votes. So we find that the Brussels is politically insensitive to normal calculations of how do we manage this problem. I'm elected, we need your money, but I need my votes. And I think this is the challenge that is facing the Eurozone countries. The problem which I put forward, and this is not typical of people who write about Europe, is that how do you justify tough agreements? Anybody can say we agree with Brussels if they like the policy. I can explain how the Eurozone crisis arose. I'm having trouble justifying the solution. But the normal way to justify it is that we adopt rules of the game through a constitution. European Union treaties are the equivalent of a constitution. If you look at national constitutions of member states, they normally have some rule for a double majority. In the case of Sweden, I believe, you have to have an election and another parliament. So that's one form of parliamentary decision. In the case of Ireland, you have to have a referendum. And in other countries, you have to have a two-thirds majority. 10 countries require referendums on constitutions. The European Union has two unusual features. They say we can only have a treaty go forward if every member state approves. But any member state can have a referendum. So 99% of European citizens were not consulted on the Lisbon Treaty. Only the Irish were allowed to vote, and they had to vote twice to produce the right answer. So you have a problem of getting agreement. The normal democratic rule is that two-thirds, three-quarters, a large bloc, but you don't give a veto. It's not an absolute right that one person or one state can veto what the rest of the group does. Unlike you might have human rights, this is constitutional amendments are about rules of government that are not violating human taxes, spending, this, that, electing people. And the European Union is now engaging in trying to increase integration on the economy, penetrating national budgets, without a constitutional amendment, without any the only justification that can be offered by the Greeks was that we all enjoy living well on other people's money. The Irish can say, we were speculating like crazy on the housing market, and the banks were fueling it, and our damn fool government agreed to bail out the banks instead of the people. They each have a different reason for what went wrong. But to say we have to cut health or education because of some target adopted 3%, why 3%? This was not written, on the day of creation. It was probably chosen at 2 a.m. And all the technical mechanisms for deciding whether you accept it or violating it have error margins, substantial error margins, because you're saying, what will your deficit be next year? On the one hand, nobody can be sure, but the rules say you should make some cuts. The other thing is the politics of the people running the Eurozone is we don't want a treaty. And the peculiarity in German language is that the word Vertrag means both treaty and contract. I asked Uwe Kitzinger, who's English for the usual 1938 reasons, what his father would have called the Versailles Settlement. You have views as Hungarians. Because I wanted to get, was that a treaty or a Vertrag? He just said, Diktat. And I think some Hungarians historically took that view. So you have a problem of Brussels trying to do something that may be economically necessary. Talking about democracy won't get rid of the international bond market. It won't get rid of the IMF. If the IMF bails out, the international bond market will bail out with it. And they're not committed to saving European finances. You have the median European, the 30%. It's not that they're against closer union, saving the Eurozone. They haven't been consulted. And I think here the broad problem of the 28 countries and of Brussels as the 29th country of the 28 is to strengthen the mechanisms for consultation. My own answer in one word is pan-European treaty referendums, but we can discuss that if you like.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation. I think it was very important for us to understand the big picture and all the problems of political representation and attitudes of different countries and so on. So thank you very much, and we will continue.
Well, may I ask you then, Professor Rose, that when we discussed your topic yesterday at our special dinner with all the invited guests, you called yourself pragmatic.
Yeah.
And you know, maybe it helps the audience to understand your position if you explain your own relation to the European integration process. Please make it shortly.
Pragmatism is a philosophy of examining problems one by one, being very careful, saying what is the problem. For example, is the Eurozone a financial problem, or is it about saving the European Union? I think it was a mistake to say it was about saving the European Union. It was rhetoric, but dangerous rhetoric. Secondly, you look at experience. And the experience of European integration, the single Europe market, the free movement of peoples, European Central Bank and its powers to enforce its standards. We now have lots of experience post-World War II, post-1989. We don't have to speculate. Pragmatism is what is the problem, what is the experience, what are the constraints? Because politicians like to solve problems with solutions that can't be applied. They're more academic than academics. And because politics is about differences of opinion, then you're going to have more than one option. As a professor of public policy, I think it's up to elected politicians to determine the option, but better to have real options than unreal options. And I think your politicians may prefer unreal options. So I think there's a lot of pragmatism about. If I can give an example with the Eurozone, the mess, Greece is in, the 3% is there. What are our options? Try and cheat, but not so visibly, because you've got to cheat on your own rules. But how do we cheat? Reasonable people can find different ways, and then you have the hegemony because nobody wants to argue if you want to call purple red or purple blue. If others want to believe it, we will engage in it too. It's about confidence.
Thank you.